This week, we welcome writer Farrah Storr. She is currently the head of writer partnerships for Substack UK, and she was formerly the editor-in-chief of Elle, Cosmopolitan, and Women's Health.
Vogue magazine in the UK became basically a political manifesto. It became incredibly political, and the editor there has just resigned. And whilst he did so much good, he completely diversified fashion. But of course, what's been left is Vogue is now a sort of political manifesto, and so whilst that's commendable, and some would say it's had huge sort of seismic change on the culture, it's not something you want to read anymore. And so it's going to be very hard for another editor to come in and suddenly go, let's talk about fashion now, which is what was always the point of Vogue.
This is Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Phetasy. I'm Bridget Phetasy, and you are welcome. You know the drill. Please subscribe, rate, comment, share, reach out, tell your friends, send smoke signals, whatever. We love your feedback and we want to hear from you. If you like our work and want to support us, the best way to do that is join Phetasy.com. You'll get access to behind-the-scenes content, outtakes, discounts on merch, and the ability to submit questions for some of our upcoming guests. Support your favorite scrappy little internet heroes at Phetasy.com. All right. I'm with Farrah Storr, everybody. Welcome to Walk-Ins Welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to talk to you about writing, as I'm always excited to talk to anybody about writing. But I think what's really interesting is you had this huge career in magazines and at all of the kind of bigger magazines, and then you pivoted into Substack, and now you have a very successful Substack, and I love what you do with it. And I think for people who are not necessarily, I think everyone kind of knows what Substack is, but I'm still not sure it's gone fully mainstream. What's your feeling on that?
Well, it's interesting from where I'm sat, which actually is in England. It's definitely not gotten as mainstream as it is in the US. So yeah, I think you're right. And just to give you an example, when I handed in my notice at Elle magazine, everybody had thought in the UK that I'd gone to work for Snapchat. So I was like, no, it's Substack. But yeah, you're totally right. I think also the other thing is everybody thinks that Substack is a newsletter platform, so you have to be a
Right.
writer. But since I joined, which was like 18 months ago, I always say to people, it is a newsletter platform. That's how it started. But actually, the better way to think of it is it's like your own media channel where you can reach people however you want, through video, through voice notes. If you're a writer, you can write. And I think that's very freeing if you're any sort of creative, whether you're a writer or whether you're an artist or a poet. So that's probably the easiest way to think about it. It's your personal media channel.
Oh, I like that. I feel like, I've been on a lot of these platforms, and I'd started on Patreon, and then I moved over to Locals, and then I didn't really want to start a Substack until I knew I could be consistent with it. So we're always trying to get one plate spinning, and then once we know we can manage that, keep adding to it. And now I'm on Substack, and I really think it's actually quite beautiful, the design. It makes everything very easy. And I like that they're shifting into more video, because it's always seemed like, for me as someone who's been kind of at the forefront of all of these platforms, I still have yet to encounter one that does everything that I need. Substack comes close. It's still not quite there. If somebody can integrate a storefront, then they have all of my business. But it's still not, I still have to sell my stuff elsewhere and direct people out. And video seems, I don't see that much video on Substack yet, but maybe it's just not, maybe I just haven't encountered it.
Yeah, and I think, the reality is it started as a platform for writers. So
Mhm.
the real heart of it is still writers. So yeah, I mean, Patti Smith is a brilliant example of somebody who uses video in the most beautiful and sort of amusing way, which is she basically does sort of book reviews from her bedroom with her cat in the background.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, so it's not polished, it's totally rustic. And so for me, that's the best. If anybody wants to see a brilliant video on Substack, I would check out Patti Smith.
I'm going to check her out. I need to see because my husband and I have a podcast that's only on we pretty much it lives on um Substack, and then we do questions and answers kind of behind, but we want to shift into video and even just doing like we want to do baby product reviews because we have a new baby and my husband's a huge consumer, and I feel like that would be a fun thing to experiment with video on Substack just to dip our toe into, put some stuff for free and other stuff behind the paywall just because I think that that's a nice thing about Substack is even though it feels like your own media channel, it also feels like there is a level of intimacy you have with your subscribers that you don't have with a traditional media channel.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that I actually think the best thing about Substack for me is that relationship with the community. You know, one of the things that really shocked me when I first joined Substack, both as an employee, but also when I started my own, was when you see the comments, you know, it's not just people putting out their opinion to the world. They are talking to one another, and there's like none of that drama that you see on other social media platforms. They are there to talk, they are there to think, and it just feels very nuanced. It's a nice place to be. So yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. How did you get started in writing and what was your career trajectory? Did you always want to be a writer or was it something that you stumbled into?
I didn't stumble into it, God no. I grew up in Manchester, in the north of England, and I had a very, very strict South Asian father. My mother's English, my father's from Pakistan. And so the expectation was, of course, for all of us to be doctors or lawyers or engineers, and everything else was failure. So God forbid you were a writer. And yet I loved writing. I loved magazines. I grew up with magazines. I learned everything from, sex positions to, how to, ace an interview, all from magazines. But there were two problems. First problem was my father would never have allowed me to be a writer because I think A, it doesn't have the status, or certainly his interpretation of a writer didn't carry much status. And secondly, understandably, and you'll know this as much as I know this, it's a precarious life. Some
Yes.
make it to the top, but there's not many. So actually, my sister, I have a lot to thank for. She's got 10 years on me. She was the dutiful elder sister. She went and was a lawyer, was utterly miserable. And then she won a competition in a magazine, and part of what you won was you won a date with two male models, but you also won, I think it was like 2 weeks work experience.
Mhm.
And I remember she did the work experience on this magazine. It was called More Magazine. I don't think they had it in America, although you did have a magazine called More Magazine, but this British one was very different. It was sort of quite a naughty magazine. And I remember my sister came back to Manchester and she's like, "You wouldn't believe it." She said, "People work on these magazines and they get paid to do it, and it's amazing and it's interesting and it's full of like-minded people. But of course, the problem was it's really hard to get a job on a magazine." And so, to cut a very long story short, I deliberately went to a university in London because I had to somehow get myself down to London, because if you're not in London, it's a bit like, the magazine industry in America. If you're not in New York,
Yes.
you've not really got a chance. And I just did a lot of I did a lot of free work for a long time, and then I got a job, and I sort of took it from there. But I never saw myself as a writer. I was sort of very classic in that I was a writer to start with, but I moved up the ranks basically to earn more money. I very quickly got into editing, and I somehow, even though I always wanted to be a writer, I think actually ended up being a better editor than I ever was a
Mm.
writer.
And where did that lead you?
What, becoming an editor?
Yeah, where were you working for all how many years were you in the industry and where were you working and
Yeah, so my first job, I mean, I sort of went backwards in terms of where I worked in sort of age demographics. My first job was on Good Housekeeping magazine,
Mhm.
and I pretty much every year, career counselors tell you you should never change jobs too regularly, but I changed jobs every 18 months. So I was at Good Housekeeping, then I went to, God, where did I go? Eve magazine, Top Sante. You'd never have heard of any of these magazines. They've all closed now. Um, I worked at Glamour magazine. I moved to Australia to work at Marie Claire out there. I made all my mistakes in Australia, I say. And then I came back and I launched Women's Health in the UK. And then after that, because Women's Health was this sort of it should never have worked really. It was sort of an impossible job because it was like two people, no money. But we somehow managed to make that success. And then after that, I sort of became the person to go and fix things. And I got asked, I think it was 2015. I was working on women's health. I was very happy there. And I got asked to sort of relook at Cosmo and try and think about that for a new audience. And so I did Cosmo, and after that I did Elle. And Elle was probably the sort of end of the road for me because it coincided with, I think, the end of the road for magazines, really.
Mm. There's a couple things that you talked about in there that I want to discuss. The first being, what mistakes did you make in Australia? What did you learn while you were there?
Oh, I mean, I think I was ambitious, I think, to the point of not understanding um, the limitations of my ability, actually. I talked about I moved jobs every 18 months. And the truth is, when I moved to Australia, I took on this big job at Marie Claire. I was really crap at it. I mean, that's the reality. I was really crap. And it was the first time in my life that I'd actually been met with sort of quite incredible failure. Like my copy would come back, it'd all be written in red, and it changed the color of everything. I was so depressed. And for a while, and I think it's really easy to do, it was everybody else's fault. It wasn't me. The editor didn't understand me. The deputy didn't understand me. I was really talented. But of course, the reality is I was, there was nothing wrong with the editor. She was a good editor. I just wasn't ready for the job. And it was very sobering experience. But actually,
What was the job exactly?
I was features director, so
Okay.
in charge of all the writing across all of the magazine.
Wow.
And, Marie Claire in Australia was a highly prestigious magazine, was
Okay.
really at the height of its powers at that point. And, I wasn't terrible, but I don't think I was quite ready. I think I was probably about a year or two, from doing that job very well. So, I know a lot of people say, well, and look, I've written a book about discomfort. You should push yourself into those things which make you feel uncomfortable, but you can push yourself to a point where you feel panicked and completely overwhelmed. And I
Mhm.
think that job made me recognize what that felt like. And I didn't ever really want to do that again. So
Mhm.
it was a good experience, but it's a very painful experience.
And when did you realize that it wasn't everyone's fault? Was it years later, decades later? It sounds like almost getting sober. When you get sober, you're suddenly like, "Oh, I was the crazy person all along."
You know what? I think it was when I became an editor. I
Uh-huh.
it was simply that, and you suddenly understood with absolute clarity, the position that that editor must have been in, and actually they were trying to be helpful, but I just wasn't ready for the job. So it was probably I became an editor about 4 or 5 years after that. So that was the moment when I was like, "Oh, hang on a minute. Everybody wasn't wrong. Actually, I was wrong." And the only thing actually that I could change was myself. You can't change anybody else. So even if they had have been the ones at fault, which they weren't in this occasion, it was a brilliant lesson in, there's no point in sort of putting the blame out onto the world. You are the only thing you can control. You know, you've got to deal with this alone.
Yeah, that's a hard lesson I think we all have to learn at some point. It seems like it's just also part of becoming emotionally mature and growing up is realizing that you could just point the finger forever, but it's really kind of a waste of time. It doesn't it's not going to get you anywhere.
I think that's right. And you know, you often see those people, don't you? They've spent their whole life. It's really easy to blame because of course if you blame outwards, you never have to look inwards and acknowledge what you're dealing with. And of course, looking inwards and acknowledge that maybe you've got shortcomings is very, very difficult. And human beings do not like that. But actually, in the short term, it's so much better because, God, I know so many people, and I possibly could have been this person. They spend their life blaming other people, and then they find themselves one day standing on this starting line, and everybody else has moved past them. And they have to ask the question, well, how come everybody's over there and I'm stood here? And the reality is, it's because, well, they probably had to look inward at some point and realize the problem was them. And they got to make amends and fix it if they want to get over there. So I never wanted to be that person who was staying on the starting line, blaming the world for why they hadn't got any further.
Yeah. What is the biggest difference between being an editor and being a writer? What was that transition like in your brain when you had to make that switch?
I mean, it's actually very different. I think if you have been a writer and you are an editor, I do think it's very good. You know, the whole point with an editor is, and this is the reality of it, it's actually quite a commercial role. Your job is to sell magazines. Your job is to increase circulation. Your job is to get advertisers to spend their money in your magazine. When you're a writer, it's just you and the words on the page. And if you've written an amazing paragraph with the best sentences since Virginia Woolf, you do not want anybody tampering with them. If you're the editor, you've got to look at that and go, well, we've only got so many pages, and actually this is a bit irrelevant. And so I would say it's a very commercial role being an editor, but at the same time, the best editors are commercially minded, but they have the soul of a writer. So actually, they understand, because I do know a lot of editors who can be quite heartless with writers. You have to understand the the love that writers pour into their work as well. So it is it's a real balancing act actually. And I feel lucky that I was a writer before I became an editor. But you know, I was never a stylist. So probably if you were to ask my fashion teams what I was like as an editor, you'd probably get a very different answer than if you were to ask the writers on my team, who I spent a lot of time with, who would probably give you a very different answer.
Interesting. Yeah, I've never been too precious with my work. I'm not one of those. I know writers who hate most editors and they don't
Right.
want to. And I'm very much like, I feel like I give the editor a good editor. I was also very spoiled in the beginning of my writing career, having brilliant editors, and then I had other editors, and I suddenly became aware of why people might be frustrated or not like their editors. But my editors always pushed me to be better, dig deeper, and still managed to maintain my tone, which I thought was that's the hard thing to do. They weren't rewriting. They would ask me questions. They wouldn't, they'd push me when I was being lazy, which was often, and they would drive me crazy in that way, but I knew they were right. I internally I couldn't lie to myself about that. But I always kind of felt like they made me way better than I was. So I always sensed, I'd say to all my great editors, like, you're Michelangelo. I'm just like the marble. I'm just handing over you can turn it into whatever statue you want to turn it into. But good editors are, yeah, the great editors I've had have made me a much better writer. It's
And I
been like
think,
school.
yeah, I think you're right, and I've had those editors too, and it's very gracious of you to say they're like Michelangelo. But you're right, the best editors, they will push the writer to get the best from that writer. I also think they'll have a good relationship with that writer, and they'll understand what makes that writer tick, what makes them excited. There's no point giving a feature idea to a writer who has zero interest in the idea in
Hmm.
front of them. So yeah, I think that's right. I think the other thing about an editor is, and I think this is where the relationship between writer and editor is so important, is the thing that sometimes writers, and my husband is a writer, so I can say this, but sometimes what I found as an editor was tricky for writers to understand was you're pushing the writer to be the best they can be. But at the same time, you've almost got this bigger jigsaw puzzle where this feature that I've commissioned with this brilliant writer then has to fit into this jigsaw puzzle of all these other things in my magazine. And a reader has to go from page to page and feel a sort of beautiful rhythm running throughout. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a very, I think that's probably the most delicate and perhaps difficult thing for an editor. And you never tell the writer you're dealing with, by the way, but you've always got in the back of your mind, okay, I'm going to push Bridget to do this. I think we always wanted you to write for us, actually, and we never managed to commission you when I was at Elle. That's
Yeah,
right.
I was so, that was at such a time when I was so, I mean, it's again, partially laziness, partially biting off too many projects that I
Good.
can't, it feels like even though at my heart and soul, the two things that I want to do the most, oh, it's like that resistance, you know, I think at my heart and soul, I'm a writer more than anything. And then I started doing podcasts, and then I started my YouTube show, which I get to write comedy for that, which also feels very much like what my heart and soul wants to do as a performer. And it just all got so crazily busy. And I think writing, when I do the cost benefit analysis, it's not always the thing that is, it takes so much time. And it's like when I break down the hours for the payment, even at $1 a word, it's still, I had a business manager who basically looked at what I was getting paid for my writing and said, "This is marketing." He was
Yeah.
like, "You can't look at this as a way that you're making your income because it's not scalable. And every piece that you do, when you break it down hourly, is essentially a marketing tool just to get your name out." But he was like, this isn't how you're making your living right now.
And it's crazy, isn't it? Because in many ways, he was absolutely right. But of course, what happens is, and that's why the industry is sort of falling around us in bits, is writers, maybe I'm speaking out of turn here, Bridget, but a lot of creatives now who do podcasts and they have YouTube videos, a lot of them, when you ask them what they love the writing, but the writing was never going to pay the bills. And so it then becomes, it becomes the thing that they want with their heart. But actually, it's very easy to become quite bitter about writing because you love it, but it's the thing which will, it will punish you. Because I was talking to someone the other day and they went, I wrote 600 articles in a year and I can't remember how much they earned, but it was not enough to pay their rent. And you could see
Wow.
the writer loved writing, but there is this, you give it everything and it still won't pay your rent for you. And that's the heartbreaking thing about it.
You know, I have that book that did daily routines of all the like brilliant artists and whatnot. And they're all independently wealthy. You know, it's like,
Yeah.
oh, he woke up and then he went to the cafe and then he talked to his buddies for 3 hours and then took a stroll through the woods. And you're like, no one can do this unless they're independently wealthy.
Right.
There were few who had day jobs. Almost all of my favorite writers had day jobs for a long time before they became
They made it.
writers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. I mean, it's like, I love Orwell, but Orwell, came from a good background. I mean, of course, he was wonderful in that he went out and he sort of knew what it was like to be poor, but Orwell was from money. Virginia Woolf was, the Bloomsbury set, they were largely from a sort of upper class background. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? I was talking to someone the other day about, the media has got many problems, but its real diversity issue in the UK, at least, is a class one.
Same
That's
in
the
the United
reality.
States. I've had
Yeah.
people on this podcast to talk about exactly this. Batya Sargon talks about how essentially to become a journalist, you have to be able to go live in New York City for free so you can be an intern at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and you need to have pretty wealthy parents to be able to go do an internship in New York City where you're not essentially getting paid. Who can do that? No, only kids who come from wealth, essentially, and that creates a big problem with the lens through which everything is viewed in our media.
Yeah, and it's absolutely right. I think the other thing that occurred to me, I remember, this is particular, and I loved glossy women's magazines, by the way, but
Me too.
I do remember, the whole point of glossy magazines is it's about aspiration. These magazines are always about 50 steps out of your reach. That's the whole point of them. You'll never quite get there. But then if you are a kid from a working class background and you come into these buildings, and they're usually these incredible buildings, everybody has a blow. I mean, I remember when I got there, I didn't really know what a blow dry was. Everybody had blow dries, everyone has manicures. You go to these press events, people know how to behave a certain way, they know how to do small talk. And if you're a kid who hasn't come up through, say, in the UK, an Oxbridge system where you are learnt, the art of small talk or the art of questioning and challenging, you can get to the glossy magazine office, but once you get there, you can go, I sod this just isn't, because it's just constantly feels like it's working against you. And in a way, I think all those unspoken things, how do you make small talk at a dinner party? That's the really tough stuff. And that's when, again, I'm speaking just from a UK point of view, you can really feel like, maybe this world isn't so much for me after all. So I would think that is the real problem.
I feel that way now. I feel that way
Really?
about me in the industry. I'll go to certain kind of events or stuff with people who are all in our space, and they have big names, and they come from Columbia, and they come from Ivy League, and they all went to, from college right into the, I mean, I struggle with imposter syndrome anyway, but I don't feel, when I'm at these dinners and whatnot, I always feel like I'm a waitress who somehow managed to sneak my way into being a guest at the dinner. And it's a lot of my own insecurity, but I don't come from the same place at all. So I don't have the same insider knowledge of the editors and the way they've moved around, and there's a lot of the conversation that is alienating to somebody who didn't. It's a bubble,
That's right. Yeah.
It's, if you're not from and in that bubble, it can feel very much like you don't belong. And also, I'm not sure that I want to belong.
Yeah. That's the other thing. That's it. You get there and you realize that actually the belonging actually starts before the office. It starts in the schools. Often, I've often been at parties where people have gone, what school did you go to? And you're like, what school did I go to? And I was like, Stand College. And and of course what it is it's like, which public school did you go to? And it's this shortcut, isn't it? And it's even the way people wear their collars, or if they have a ring on their finger worn in a certain way, there were all these signs and signals of, you're one of me, you're sort of my sort of person. And you're right, you don't want to belong to it, because actually the most exciting people are often outside of the bubble. But it's still bloody hard if you're 21 years old and you're stood there without a ring on your pinky finger, and not knowing that Marlborough is a school rather than a fag. It's hard.
Yeah. Yep. I was always kind of the kid around this. I encountered this even recently in LA. And it was actually very painful. It was a lifelong friend of mine. I grew up in a wealthy resort town as like a like a working class kid. In Newport, Rhode Island was where we spent summers, because my dad lived there, not because we were summering there, but that was like the playground of the rich. And a lot of my friends when I was young and we partied together and we hung out together, but I was never one of them. They went to boarding school together. They went to sports group together at the private beach club. Like, these kids had come up. Their parents all had cocktail parties together. They knew all of the right manners. I had a friend, I still to this day, but I had a friend, and I would laugh because he could be blackout drunk and high on drugs, and he would still stand up when a woman entered the room, no matter, just it was like so deeply ingrained in him, though it was great manners, but also it was just, he came from that very wealthy elite class. And I had another friend who I met later in life in LA, And he knew I was trying to be a screenwriter and a writer in Los Angeles. And he was, of course, became kind of a producer, because what else are you going to do when you have lots of money? And never really read my stuff or offered to help or anything. Just was like, keep going, good luck, And then my friend, who was from the same world as him, he was helping her produce everything. And I was like, this is because you guys go to the same island in Florida, It's like your parents. It was such a moment. And I was in my late 30s when this happened, where I was like, yeah, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how talented I am or how that they help each other, because it's like money marries money, rich get richer. It's just
Right. But I suppose it goes back to the earlier point, isn't it? It's that you're totally right. You can give up and just be exasperated and go, I'm never going to be part of that. And that would, and whilst it's true, I always find that it's sort of so disheartening to concentrate on that, even though it's true. You've got to go, well, okay, well, what's the thing I can take control of? I can just be undeniable. I can just ace it and work 10 times harder, and I'll just have to find another way, but I will find another way. And look, I mean, look, you're doing really well. So you found the other way.
And it forces creativity. And I don't know. I feel like one of the things I also realized is that I used to feel envious and resentful and all of these things of people, particularly because of my upbringing, of people who were trust fund kids and came from money. And now they didn't ask to be born into that, first of all, in any way that someone didn't ask to be born into extreme poverty or middle class or wherever they were born. They also never get the true sensation of hustling. And honestly, the hustle gives me so much life. They might be able to, I'm sure they'll be hard workers, but when you have that big of a safety net, you never really, I'm kind of convinced it's why so many of them just fall into like drug addiction and despair. They have to create something to pull themselves up out of. But that sense of hustle it gives me so much life. It's just like life giving to me. And being able to, now that we live in this time where we have places like Substack and our own media channels, I find it to be just so invigorating as a creator. And even if people don't necessarily take me seriously or think, even just yesterday, someone was like, you like to sit on the sidelines. I'm like, okay, if sitting on the sidelines is having 3 podcasts and a monthly call, like, I don't know what your version of the sidelines is, but it's just because I'm not at a big media company. Right. Even still, there's like the circling of the wagons. So interesting. Yeah, interesting.
I mean, you are absolutely right about. I was saying to someone the other day, it's like, why are all these aristos they all die in sort of pits of drug addiction? Like, what is it? And I love that theory of you've got to drag yourself out of something. But yeah, and to your point, the hustle helps you. The hustle not only ignites you, but you start to figure out actually what you're made of. And I think there's nothing like hustle to make, when your teachers go, oh, if only you could unlock your true potential. And I always used to think, well, where is this potential? How do I figure out what it is? And you hustle. That's how you figure out what it is. So I think you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, it's been so. It's interesting too, because the other day I was thinking about something when you were talking about blame. Now we have another thing to blame other than just people and institutions. We also can blame, or in my instance, I'll be like, it's the algorithm. And on Twitter the other day, I'm like, it's not the algorithm. I just suck. Like really having to face this about myself.
Just not good enough.
Or just not doing. I look at some of the things that people do to optimize their channels or whatever, and I don't do that stuff. Maybe I'm creating a television show called Dumpster Fire, but we treat it like a television show on YouTube, and we're like, why isn't this getting more traction? Well, you have I have credits at the end, like a show, that it doesn't bounce to the next video. There's so many little tweaks I'm sure I could make to optimize that show for the actual medium that it's on. And we're like, it's the algorithm. And it might be the algorithm, but now you have this invisible force that people can blame on top of everything else that you used to be able to point fingers at.
But in a way, in all seriousness, about the algorithm question, I was looking at Instagram the other day, and I sort of barely go on there now because I just constantly get surfaced videos of pit bulls. I don't know why, pit bulls in bow ties. So I sort of just don't go on there anymore. I obviously looked at a video once for pit bull in a bow tie. But you can see all
That's
these
a
other
funny
people.
stand-up routine. Like, I love how that's the thing that they're like, oh, she looked at one video that defines her. That's all we're going to feed her now.
I feel like they define me by the pit bull in the bow tie. But you can see all these other creators, writers, whatever you want to call them, who are brilliant, and they're now all at the slaves of this algorithm. And I have to say, Bridget, it looks effing exhausting.
I know it does.
And also you can see all these sort of 40 and 50 somethings thinking, I really don't want to be doing this real anymore, but it's the algorithm. And so it's like, where does it get you to? What happens? What's the end game? And I'm not sure.
It's so tough though. I mean, as somebody who's been, again, I feel like I've been riding this wave since it just started. And even with Substack, you just kind of get going. And then now, like, Elon has some personal beef against Substack, and I'll post the link and the link doesn't even appear. I'm like, oh God. I was on Locals. They got bought by Rumble. It's crazy because as much as there's a lot of liberation, it still feels as unsettling and not stable as when I was at Playboy at the end of the magazine era. I don't feel like I'm still on solid ground. I feel like now it's interesting too. I love the direct relationship you have with subscribers, but there was something nice about being dependent on also advertising. I think the balance is the way to go because subscribers they're fickle. You can say one thing somewhere else and suddenly they're like, and good for you. You take your dollars where you want, but this is how people get completely captured by their audience too.
Yeah, I mean, let me tell you, advertisers can be pretty fickle too. I spent
Of course.
Oh my God. But no, you're right. And the interesting thing about that, when you're not at the mercy, well, you are at the mercy in a way, because actually your readers are paying you to exist. Really.
It's so true. I'm very aware of this.
but I don't know about you, but it keeps you on your A game. It's like because somebody said to me the other day, well, I'm really scared about Substack because I haven't got an editor. And I was like, let me tell you, your reader will become your editor, because the minute you start being sloppy, you can see in your open rate, you can see in your paid subscriptions. And I have to say, as terrifying to your point as that can be, it sort of serves, certainly to me and other writers I know, it serves like this sort of huge editor, which is you've got to keep it at a certain standard. And I personally, my personality type, I like that. But yeah, that's probably the way to think about it. But look, the thing is, Bridget, I think the world now, I think that whole idea of a job for life and a corner office, I just don't think it exists in most, not in many places anymore, actually.
No.
And friends I know who are just hanging on, except they're all working from home now, with a Peloton bike in their office. But the ones that used to have the glass corner office and everybody, oh, you've got a job for life. I mean, they were like the hours that they had to put. I mean, they were literally a slave to their desk. So it's sort of, I think everything feels like it's a bit on quicksand at the moment. But I think we've got the options to sort of figure out, well, okay, what looks like, perhaps the most version of a nourished life for me. But I think those stable jobs now, I certainly don't know anybody who's in a job for life anymore or would want one, actually.
I feel like that was true when I was evaluating going to college 20 years ago. This is why I dropped out of college. I said to my dad, what you guys have does not exist. And even though I didn't know what would take its place, I knew that coming out of college with an enormous amount of debt would only be putting me in a position of being behind the 8 ball for however, God knows how long. And so I just ended up, I was like, well, I want to be a writer. And I learned how to do that in kindergarten. So
Yeah, better start soon.
yeah, I might as well not put myself in debt on top of it. It already seems like a horribly precarious career to want to go into. And I think that was actually a good decision looking back, even though at the time I felt like maybe I was making the wrong move. It didn't seem practical to me to go to college if I want to be a doctor or something, and if you want to specialize in something, but I felt like I could learn what I needed to learn from doing it and editors and reading.
I think that's right. I mean, I always used to feel bad when, we'd have these lovely work experience, individuals who would come into the office and they'd tell you they're at university, and then they tell you they were doing a master's and then maybe a PhD. And I would always say to them, I'd say, look, I didn't go to journalism college. I did go to university, I said, but I didn't go to journalism college. And I only went to King's College in London, my university, so I could spend most of the time doing work experience in magazines. I said, you do not need to go to college. You do not need to saddle yourself with debts. Get into a magazine office quickly. And you could see nobody had sort of told them this before. But again, it goes back to the gatekeeping, doesn't it? It's like, you've got to get this degree and then you've got to do this. And it's like, no, you don't. You just need to start quickly, because you're going to spend years trying to earn as much as your friends, and it's going to take, and you never will, by the way, but you will have an amazing life. And that's one thing I would say about writers is, you might be poor for a while, but it's an interesting life. And I don't know about you, Bridget, but my husband and me were talking the other day, and we're talking about how much we hate small talk, and it's just so difficult. He's much worse than me. And he said, it's because when you're a journalist, and you're interviewing people like murderers, or, people you've been through divorce, or you cut straight to the chase. You go into the most interesting part of the conversation. You get to the heart and soul of that person. And so as a writer, I hate this word, but it's such a privilege to do that. It just means that it's very hard to have normal friends after that.
I find too, though, that I can't stand small talk either, but I just don't do it. So I'll find people and cut. I think my husband always jokes that people will tell me their whole life story, and I'm like, it's just because I don't want to do small talk.
Right, that's right.
It's really just because I want to hear their whole life story. Yeah. So I when I'm asking you how you are and you say I'm okay, I'm gonna key in on that and dig into why. I won't be like, oh, okay, well, that's nice anyway. I just was never very good at it in general. I find it is painful. My husband hates it more than me. I actually think he's better at it than me, but he hates it more than I do.
We have a thing at our house where we very rarely get invited to dinner parties ever, because we have no friends between us. but when the small talk is literally getting so tiny, he'll just start squeezing my knee really hard, and then it's like, okay, we just need to leave. But just back to your earlier point, because it's making me think about dinner parties. One of the things that I always used to say to writers, and you may disagree with me here, but I remember there are journalists that I've met in my life who generally did the celebrity circuit, where they interviewed celebrities, and they'd come back and they go, yeah, I'm friends with such and such now. And I'm like, you're not their friend. Like, you're a journalist. Like, you no matter how well you got on with them, you're not their friend. And I used to find that, particularly being an editor, you would get invited to so many amazing things, into people's houses, and you would find yourselves at these dinner parties. But of course, you were the poorest person at the table, and you were, in many ways, the entertainment. And so I always used to think to myself, God, it would be so easy to convince yourself that actually this is my status in life, this is who I am. But I always had to remind myself, no, it's because you're the editor of Elle, or it's because you're the editor of Cosmo. And you can't get attached to the status that brand brings to you, because it is going to go at some point, and you've got to be prepared for that.
This was one of the other things that I wanted to talk to you about from earlier when I said there were a number of things. The death of the magazine is something that I mourn still. I just was like you. I loved glossy magazines. I loved Rolling Stone. I always wanted, I just, I was such a just magazine addict. I'm still, by the way, a sucker for magazines. And my husband will not let me go to the grocery store because I am the person that checking out sees the avocado issue of whatever $13 magazine is right there, and I have to have it. He's like, "Oh my God, Bridget, can you not spend $15 on a magazine on your way out of the grocery store?"
Well, you're a rare species, Bridget. There's not many of you left who'll spend $13 on an avocado special of
It's
Oprah
so
magazine.
stupid. Yeah, because it's idiotic. I can get all of these recipes online, but I love the actual physical magazine. I have a monthly column at Spectator magazine, and I get the magazine and I love it. It's just so nice to have. It's great in the summer for the beach. It's nice, to have when you're just, I know we all flip through our phones now, but I'll tell you, I miss going to the doctor's office and randomly just being at the mercy of whatever magazines were there and picking one up and flipping through it.
But I think you're right. You said it there, like being at the mercy of them. It's a completely immersive experience, and that's why it's so tribal. It's like there are certain editors, and who's the editor of the Spectator? I think it's Fraser Nelson. I feel like it's Fraser Nelson. But there are
Is that
certain
the UK?
the UK, yeah,
I
the
think,
UK,
yeah. So I
UK,
am at the US magazine.
US. But there are certain editors of magazines where the reader is enthralled to their taste, what they put together, and they trust you implicitly that when Bridget turns the page, even if she woke up that morning knowing she didn't know anything about Ukrainian politics, now she does, and she trusts that that editor will have put in the perfect piece that will talk to her. And you're totally right that you can find all of this stuff on the internet, but I don't want to sit there and go, okay, what is, I mean, I don't know about you. Sometimes I feel like I've run out of internet, but it's because I can't think of what to input into Google. Whereas on a magazine, somebody has done this beautiful curation for you where you don't have to think. All you have to do is just delve in. And I think that's why it will be sad. I don't want them to end. I never want them to end. I am like you that spends $13 on the avocado issue. But it's, paper costs are rising.
Yeah.
Advertising is pretty much eaten up by, Meta and Google. Nobody wants to be a writer anymore because of what we've just spoken about. So I can't really see, some of them will survive, but not all of them will, or they will morph into something else. And in morphing into something else, I think a certain sort of magic will have gone.
Yeah, it's not the same. The internet is not. It's like that. I'm okay with now reading on my iPad because I like how I can highlight things and how easy it is for me to search things. And when I'm interviewing somebody for this podcast, I can have usually I write them down by hand and put the numbered page, and it's all right there in a list if I read their book on iPad. So it's more efficient. But when it comes to even reading, I want to read a book. And my husband laughs at me because I'll travel with 3 books, and he's like, he has a Kindle and he'll blast through like 3 books. And he's like, you don't need to be lugging around all of these books everywhere you go. They have these things that can make your travel experience lighter and not as clunky, but I just love books.
But it's not the same sensory experience. I mean,
No.
it's a whole, it's even like it's a smell, the
I
smell
love
of
the
a musty
smell.
book. Yeah, the
Yep.
smell and the touch and trying to read it. Like you are complete. When you see someone reading on from a Kindle, watch them. They're sort of sat like that. If you see someone with a book, they're curled up and they're leaning into it. It's a totally different experience. And in fact, I think from my magazine days when I used to try and wow advertisers to try and get them to spend money with us, I'm pretty sure, this sounds like bullshit, but it's not. There's something about when you read words on a written page, it's absorbed better. And I actually think that's true. I think it's absolutely true. But yeah, but no more. Books will be okay.
Books will be okay.
Yeah.
Only because they're such fuel for the culture wars, I think, unfortunately. I have just
as well.
so many books on my. I was laughing the other night because I was unpacking all my books, and it was like the war on democracy, the war on. It was so. I'm like, a lot of wars going on. There were like
Oh,
5 books. The-
I thought you meant because of the culture wars, you can't read any of the books anymore.
oh no, I think they're all just, but they're books that I don't know what kind of staying power they have. I mean, I know they constantly are in need of books, and this has been, I've never written a book. Again, partially resistance, partially laziness, partially I don't want to write another one of the same book that I've read, same version of that book, which I easily could, and it would be different, but it's still something, I want something that's more, it speaks to people's humanity, not necessarily their politics or what side they might be on the culture war, or maybe they're not on any side. But I don't know. It seems like that's what makes a lot of money. These people have to make money.
Well, I mean, it is. I mean, someone said to me the other day, I don't know if it's true, but I would like to believe it is. Cancellation is so 2021 now. And I sort of feel like the whole culture wars thing, I mean, of course, it still exists. And actually, in certain countries in Europe, it's sort of at a place where in America, perhaps it was a few years ago. But, it will find its rhythm at some point, and of course then something else will come in and there'll be a whole new swathe of books. But yes, you're right, are these the books that we're going to be reading in 20 to 30 years time? Probably only as some sort of research to figure out why was everybody banning Roald Dahl, or why was everybody, so yeah, I know what you mean. You can walk into a bookshop at the moment and I just find it too political. I just feel like every single book is on activism. Every book is shouting at me. It's telling me I'm a bad person. Have I got the right views? Have I not got the right views? And, magazines, certain magazines. I mean, I wrote about this on my Substack this week about Vogue magazine in the UK. Vogue magazine in the UK became basically a political manifesto. It became incredibly political. And the editor there has just resigned. And whilst he did so much good, he completely diversified fashion. But of course, what's been left is Vogue is now a sort of political manifesto. And so whilst that's commendable, and some would say it's had huge sort of seismic change on the culture, it's not something you want to read anymore. And so it's going to be very hard for another editor to come in and suddenly go, let's talk about fashion now, which is what was always the point of Vogue. So I know what you mean about books. I think it's happening with magazines. I used to say at Elle all the time, our job is not to tell our reader what their politics is. Our job is to offer a diverse range of voices and images, and then we let the reader sit with that and make up their own mind about where they sit. But our jobs as journalists is to sit outside, unless you're working on a political magazine, of course. But in glossy magazines, we're not a political magazine. And back to your point, that's what books feel like at the moment. I feel very bored and actually exasperated by everything I see in the bookshops. Sometimes, as sort of as facile as it seems, sometimes I just want to escape. I want to be at the mercy of a brilliant story and brilliant words, and I just want to escape my life. I don't want to be told what I should be thinking and doing. And am I making any sense?
Yeah, no, I think it's this is something I saw kind of at the end of Playboy and I wasn't really a staff writer, which was great. I got to do my weekly column, and I existed outside of the being in the structure with everybody. But I definitely noticed that there were internal politics that drove a lot of what was allowed to be said, what was being said. Sometimes I would step over this invisible line that I didn't even know existed with a piece internally. And I was like, I'm already getting canceled by like the world. Why am I worried about getting canceled by my coworkers? This is insane. I should not be worried that these young people are they're gonna freak out. I almost cost my editor his job for a piece that I wrote almost satirically. I asked men to define feminism for me. And so the title of the piece, which I thought was funny, was I had men mansplain feminism, and it caused like such an uproar in the Playboy amongst the staff. I was like, ladies, you're first of all, this is a men's magazine. Shouldn't we be cheekily nodding towards men? And also, I thought it was really funny. So I just took all of their words and cut and pasted what
Brilliant.
like feminism was from the male perspective, and they were furious. Like the female editors and the female staff writers were furious. It's hilarious to me.
I think that's everything has become so serious. And actually,
so serious.
I sort of agree with. I actually think the best way to change someone's mind is you can do it with love and you can do it with humor. And actually, the more you rant and rave at people, the more resistant they are going to be. Or, of course, what will happen is they'll just divide between having their public beliefs and big smiles and nods, and then they'll have these private beliefs. And that, to me, is where the danger happens. Whereas everybody thinks we must agree with these politics on the magazine, but behind the scenes, people go, "Fuck this! I didn't," And so, I'll give you an example. I mean, not quite as funny as that. Actually, it wasn't funny at all. But when I first joined Elle, in my very first week, I got a writer to write about she'd lost a load of weight. She got to a size 0. And she'd got to a size 0 as a consequence. And she had a terrible divorce. So I said to her, I said, look, Rosie, will you write about what it was like to finally become a size 0? And blah blah blah, and the piece was brilliant. It was talking about she spent her whole life, she was my age, so she's Gen X. She spent her whole life starving herself to be like like the 90s models. She could never get to a size 0, and then she had this terrible, devastating divorce, and she suddenly got to size 0, and of course it's not what she wanted. The very thing she'd always wanted, she no longer wanted. And of course what she mentioned in the piece was women always said to her, oh, but at least she looks skinny. And so which of course, whether people like it or not, that is a response that a lot of women will have to other women, and it's a response some women like. So anyway,
or you can laugh at it. I mean,
or you can laugh at it.
We're like, well, I've had people go through. I've had some people go through something similar, and they're like, well, at least you look skinny.
Exactly.
Silver lining.
That's right. And I remember the piece was getting ready to go to press. I was like, this is amazing. It's going to be on my first issue. And my team, who were a lovely team, actually, they're really wonderful. But I was in my first features meeting with them all. And this writer put her hand up and she said, she looked really worried. She went, can I just say something really unpopular? And I was like, yes. And she's like, we've all been reading this piece and we think it's dangerous. Like, we don't think it should go in. And it was the piece about the size 0. And so we ended up having this big debate about what constitutes dangerous. And actually, at what point do you have to trust the reader to make up their own decision about whether this is a dangerous piece or not? In the end, the piece ran. And actually,
how did it do?
I mean, as you can imagine, it was one of the best read pieces online. I mean, it was just, it was a brilliant piece of journalism. But, you could see the fear, and it was genuine fear, actually, the fear in some of the younger writers on the team. And I think that fear comes from what their peers think. It's like, well, you work for a brand which feels that it's okay to do this. And, I don't know about you. I'm obviously much older than you, but I never
I don't
had
think
that.
you are.
I'm quite a bit older than you, I think.
I don't
I'm
think
44.
I'm 44.
Same age. So,
yeah.
Okay.
I'm like, you said you were Gen X. I'm like, there's like a window of 7 years is Gen X. So
Okay.
we
So
can't be. Yeah,
resolutely Gen X. But
Yes.
but you can see it. I don't know about you. I never had that. Everybody was too busy, off their head on drugs and drinking.
Yeah, that's what I always say.
Yeah, nobody cared what you wrote about, and actually, the more subversive it was, the better. Is how I remember it. But this generation, there is so much worry about the brand you work for. How is it going to be perceived to the wider ether? And that's a problem if you're a writer, because you're not going to write anything of interest. You're not going to write anything of merit. Your job is to push the culture and to test what's going on to see how flimsy it is. And if you're not willing to do that, you're going to run into trouble at some point. You're certainly not going to write anything terribly interesting, I think.
Yeah, I do think too the death of the magazine, because it was an event. The
Yeah.
each individual magazine was an event, and it was so much work went into it. And like you said, it was just always so beautifully curated. There was a theme or a feeling about it, and I don't. It's not. There's nothing like that. I don't know. It makes me sad. Are you doing just your own stuff on your Substack, or do you have other people feature? Are you treating your Substack like a magazine?
Yeah, I mean, I've only just started to. For the first year, it was very much just me writing all those features that I'd wanted to write that I never could for the magazines I edited for lots of different reasons. And now I've started to, now I'm earning money from my Substack. I've now started to pay writers to start writing on my Substack. So yeah, I mean, my Substack is very much a side hustle. It's something I do at the weekend. It's quite separate to my day job on Substack. But yeah, I think just because I've been an editor for so many years, that's the way that it will go. It will become something where it's just lots of different voices.
What is your job at Substack? I didn't even know you had a job at Substack.
Yeah.
I thought your job was your Substack.
No, no. So my job, so I left editing Elle to go and run Substack in the UK. So I'm head of
Uh,
yeah, I'm head of writer partnerships for Substack in the UK. Um, And I started a Substack at the same time because, of course, I was like, well, this is my new job. I want to know what this thing is all about and I want to see how it
mhm.
works. And of course, one of the things I discovered very quickly was it works. I mean, I now make more money on my Substack, which I write once a week, than I did when I got my first job as an editor. And I write it one day a week on a Saturday. So so it's amazing for me because I work with Substack. A big part of my job in the UK and Europe is talking to writers, going, look, there is a way that you can continue writing and you can make money from this, and you'll be paid by your readers. And then I can show them my Substack and go, and let me show you how I did it as a sort of writer at the weekend. And there's something really fascinating about that. The fact that my day job is I work for Substack, but at the weekend, I put myself in the position of the writers
Right.
who I'm basically saying, come on over to Substack. Don't give up writing. Don't leave journalism. Write on here instead. So yeah, so no, I work for Substack, my day job, and then I have my Substack on my Saturday.
Wow. What do you think is the future for Substack? My biggest fear as someone who's been again around in this space is that people will get subscriber fatigue. How do you see the future of this model?
I think the thing with Substack is when it first started, a lot of people's Substacks were kind of similar. People had different views, they wrote about different things, but it was a sort of purist newsletter platform. The interesting thing I think about the platform now is it's a bit like an iPhone. Everybody uses it completely differently. There will be a world where some people go, excuse me, my Substack is only for my community to talk about nappies, or some people will go, it is the only place where I'm just going like me, where I just write purely, or I just do voice notes. All right. So I think that's what it will be. It will be if people have a Substack, it's going to look completely different for every single person. But I sort of think the sky's the limit. I think actually, I don't think it's an alternative for the media. I think it sits side by side with the media. And I don't think Substack would ever want the media to end. I don't think I certainly don't want to live in a world where there's no free press for sure. But I could definitely see a world where most people have a Substack and they're not a writer, but it's a home for, everybody has their own thoughts that they think should probably go out into the wider world. Most people, not everybody. And you might just keep it to a few hundred people and it's a private community, or you might put it out to the world. So I think that's my gut feeling is how it will go.
Interesting. So it'll be almost like a merging of social media and a newsletter platform, like a bit of like if they had a baby.
Yeah, exactly. If they had a baby, exactly. Yeah, yeah. I personally think most people go, oh, not everyone can be a creative. I think most people have some sort of, creative something inside them, something. And I think Substack will be a way for them to exercise that to whatever size of audience they want. The audience might only be their family, but they have a Substack for their family, so their family can look and see what they're doing. So, we still don't know. It's really early days still, but you start to see the way it's being used so differently by people. And, you know, that's my feeling. And, I don't think that's a bad way to be, to unlock everybody's creative bone by them having a little Substack on the side, or a big Substack.
Do you miss magazines?
No, I don't. I'm very bad at looking backwards, I have to say. Like, when I'm
Yeah.
done with something, I never look back at it ever. I don't read the magazines anymore. I have nothing to do with the magazine world anymore, really. So no, I did my time. It was amazing. The smartest, brightest people I could ever hope to work with. But it was a time, and it's gone. And I never wanted to be that sort of person who was always looking back, going, "Oh, this time last year it was the Chanel show," and I'm always moving forward. I
Hustler.
never wanted, yeah. I suppose naturally a hustler, just always on my toes.
I feel that. And I always ask the same two questions at the end of my podcast. What is your biggest defect of character?
Probably my perfectionism, I think. I mean, because it's the never-ending search for, this is the editor in me, for making it better, make it better. I'm probably a harder editor on myself, and I mean that in terms of my entire life, than I've ever been on anyone else. And sometimes, it can be hard. That's why I love gardening, because just when you think you've got something right, nature crushes everything. You have to start all over again. And that really appeals to me. Just, keep trying and trying and trying to make things better, but you'll never tame it.
I feel like that's why I got addicted to baking bread in the pandemic.
Me too. Me
That
too.
was a weird, it's something I want to do a stand-up routine about. And also what the hell was going on? That was crazy, because you couldn't get flour anywhere. You couldn't get, I don't know what it was like there, but in the United States, you couldn't get yeast anywhere. Flour was sold out everywhere. I was like, what weird, like DNA thing was activated during the plague that everybody wanted to start making bread? I don't
Yes,
understand what that was all about. I
totally.
still think about it all the time. I'm like, can we talk about how everyone in the world suddenly needed to learn how to make bread at the exact same time?
Yeah, you couldn't get yeast in this. You couldn't get sourdough starters. You couldn't get yeast. Yes, totally right. I know. It's primitive. It must be
It's
primitive.
gotta be
It's gotta
primitive.
be.
I
Yeah,
can't blame it on Instagram, you know?
you can a bit.
A little bit.
Everyone, we're making those amazing sourdoughs with faces, but
But bread
yeah,
is hard. I
it's
had
really
no
hard.
idea.
Yeah, it will test you. It will
Oh,
push you.
I was like, I am determined to master this. It was in the starter, and I was talking to Tom Papa. He's a comedian, and he's an amazing bread maker. All the comedians are like, he'll go home and feed his starter before he like feeds his kids.
But does he still? Well, do you
He's
still
still
make
doing
bread?
it.
Still doing it? You see?
Yeah, I've been missing it. So because we just moved from LA to Texas, so everything has been insane for months. And now as I feel more grounded and settled in and everything, I'm like, I've been saying to my husband, I'm like, I want to make bread again. He's like,
It's
oh God.
time. It's time for the bread to come back.
Oh God. Yeah, it was like an obsession. He was like, I would be up at like 2 a.m. He was like, yeah, that's just how my brain works. So if something's challenging, I want to figure it out.
You
And
see, once upon a time, that would have been an amazing feature for someone. What happened? The bread makers of COVID. What happened?
I still want to do this feature.
Yeah.
I'm still curious about it. Because I want to do a stand-up routine about it. And in order to really get to the heart of what actually happened there, I would probably have to do a piece just to figure out.
Just throw it on your Substack. Put it on your Substack first, and then you do the stand-up. But I want to know
Well,
the answer.
And it was weirdly contagious because I started posting on it on I only had locals at that time in my locals community, and then like a bunch of people in the locals community started doing it and they got addicted to it. So maybe it was this weird contagion that happened on social media and it wasn't some kind of primitive thing at all. Maybe it was really just Instagram
I prefer the
influencing us.
I'd push you to go, no, go with the primitive conclusion. That's gonna be much better for the reader.
I think so. And what's your biggest asset?
Probably the same thing, I think. I think that they're two sides of the same coin. I think my biggest asset is this drive for perfection, which can never be reached. But I also think it's probably, it's probably the thing that will ruin me as well. So I think, I know it's very boring, but it's probably the same answer to both questions, which invariably often is the case. You know, I think any asset, there's often a sort of negative side to it. So yeah, the highly perfectionistic to the point it can be exhausting. But
Mhm.
the reality is, which people do not like to admit, it works.
Yeah.
It's very unfashionable to say that, but if I didn't work to this degree, I wouldn't have had the jobs or the career that I've had, and that is the reality. If you want something, you've got to work effing hard, and you stay back later than everybody else. You put in more hours. You do what you have to do. That's the reality.
There's a whole backlash to hustle culture that I'm also recently just fascinated and obsessed with. This younger, I mean, it's truly like a backlash to girl boss, backlash
Yeah.
to the people who are hustling. Exactly what you're saying is something that the younger kids are like, oh, no, we don't need to work like that. That's ridiculous. That's for, you know,
And you know
suckers.
what? Yeah, well, and they do have a point, because I'm like, they're totally right. But the thing is, you've got to decide. It's like, it is totally for suckers. And I look at it and go, oh my God, what did I do with my 30s? I just worked. But then on the same side is, you can't go, oh, I'm anxious, I can't do all this work, and then expect to have, the big country house.
They
Unless
want both.
And yeah, if you want both, I'm sorry, unless you're holidaying in Rhode Island, all your life, it probably is not going to happen. That
Yeah.
you got to choose, really.
Well, this is why I think, yeah, it's interesting. That's something I see it a lot. I'm not on TikTok, but I tend to see a lot of the TikTok videos that end up on Twitter. And I went down this, anti hustle culture rabbit hole on Twitter one night that had all these young kids making fun of
Exhaust,
Jay-Z and
yeah,
like,
exhausted millennials who've just been hustling since they came out of the womb. I know, I know.
they're so
But
tired from their online fights that they have all
That's
day.
right. And they've just given their whole soul away. Brand Me was like, that's the thing, is like, hustle culture used to be seen as really cool. But actually they ended up giving away, at least I had like it wasn't a 9 to 5 job. It's more like a 9 to 9 job, but it was a job. And then I had my personal life. Those poor geriatric millennials, they had to give everything as part of hustle culture. They were the brand. And now I don't understand much about the younger generation. I guess if you're making millions on TikTok, which most of them don't, there is an argument for, you don't have to work too hard, and you can have the house in Rhode Island, but it's a tiny,
It
tiny,
does
tiny
seem
fraction.
exhausting.
Exhausting.
Exhausting. I look at so my Instagram feed that I cultivated when I was pregnant because I couldn't handle politics or anything at all. It was all just cooking videos and bakers and all. And these videos look so time consuming. I'm like, oh my God, how long did these take to make?
Yeah,
They look,
that's
and the traveling ones. I'm like,
unbelievable.
they're so highly produced.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And the editing, and it's all so brilliantly done, but it looks like a shitload of work. As much as I like, people are like, oh, what do you do to these creators? Or like, you just make videos. I'm like, have you ever made a video?
Yeah, and a lot of those cookery videos that I watch on Instagram, you're right, they're amazing. And those are the people who aren't even making tons of money. Those are the people, they're just giving it away for free. And it's like, oh, you need to be paid for this. It's crazy.
It's
Yeah.
crazy. It's crazy. I mean, I guess the hope is that in the same way that it's the same mentality with Substack, though. It's like just open it up and let people read it for free until enough people are reading that you can maybe shut some of it down and put it behind a paywall. You're kind of hoping that if you put it out there for free, you get enough followers and then you can start getting some advertisers, I suppose.
I always say to people, actually, as soon as you start a Substack, actually, you should go paid.
That's what I did.
Yeah, I always say to people, don't just start free from the beginning. You could do some free for sure, so you can give people a taste. But you also want to do something paid from the very beginning. I always say that to writers. I'm like, switch on paid. Some people will pay you just because they love you, they love the work you've done. Your standard routine on sourdough baking in COVID made me laugh. Have some money. I think you should be turning on paid from the beginning.
Yeah, I definitely did. And I also have always pushed writers because I would hear about these young writers and I'm like, well, how much are they paying you for an outlet? And they say, oh, well, no, it's just so I can get the byline. I'm like, no, stop writing for free. It trains these people. It hurts all writers. If you're going to write this amazing piece for nothing, then it justifies in their mind how they can pay you $100. It's just like it drives the value down all across the board. Don't do that. Also, just bad for yourself.
Yeah,
ask to be paid, even if it's $100. Ask for something, just something.
Yeah, I think it's totally right. The other thing that I would say, so I think on Substack, turn paid on from the very beginning, but also the other thing that I actually think is the most important thing, and I'm going to sound like a corporate person now, and I don't mean to, but when I used to do a load of Instagram lives, and I love Instagram, or I did love Instagram before the pit bulls in the bow ties, I used to do all these Instagram lives, and I was like, hang on a minute, I don't even own I didn't have many followers, like 28,000 followers. I was like, I don't even own them. So if I ever leave this platform, then they go. And so that's the one thing I always say to writers when they join Substack. I go, look, switch on paid, get paid for some of your work, but also try and bring some of your community over so you own their emails. Like, they're yours, you've built them. So there are two things if you're a creator. Own your bloody audience and then get paid. Ideally by your audience who love your work.
Yeah, I love that. Where can we find you and your Substack?
Oh, you can find me ranting on. It's not a rant, actually, to be fair. It's called Things Worth Knowing.
And where can we find you online?
Mainly on Substack. I'm on Instagram. I'm just Farrah Storr, but I'm mainly on Substack nowadays.
Okay, I love that. Well, this has been awesome. We have to keep in touch.
Definitely. Well, look, I'm waiting for your Substack on sourdough baking.
I'll probably just turn. I'll do that. Yeah, I'll do it.
I'm waiting for it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
It's time for the weekly check-in with Bridget and cousin Maggie.
Okay.
We will conquer Substack.
One more mountain to climb.
I like the mountains. It's amazing I'm not dead on top of Everest.
We're trapped in the middle of a mountain range right now.
I'm so tired today.
Bridget's tired. I know, we were both up late last night. And then we got up and shot the dumpster fire this morning.
Ugh. I don't have anything left in my tank at the moment.
Mm-hmm. I don't blame you. It was a funny episode, though.
Yeah, the writing... I mean, honestly, these professional writers, really something else.
You're finally coming to realize
what it takes.
How is it going with your writing sprints, Bridget?
It's good. He's hard on me, which I need.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a delusional writer. He's like, 8 of the last 9 sessions, you didn't do what you said you were going to do. And I was like, that's not true. Like, for me, just doing them is a win. But he's kind of like, yeah, there's a method to this kind of exactitude, because I would start, I was going over thinking that like,
over
I
your
should
time.
get extra credit.
Yeah.
And then he's like, no, this is like overtraining. You have to think of this like an athlete. And I wasn't always starting them when I said I would, or I'd push it back in the day. And he's like, this is like training someone in a gym with baskets that aren't regulation height, and there's the ceiling's falling, and there's a monkey that occasionally runs through.
And that's pretty much Bridget's brain.
Yeah, but it's also just because I'll allow other things to get in the way of that scheduled time, and I have to be rigid about it.
I feel like but that was summary of last week, right? And you got that huge piece out, which was a big deal.
Yeah.
That took a lot of your time. But I feel like this week you've been much more diligent and on schedule. Is that not true?
Yes, I've been diligent and on schedule this week, and this week's goal is to end with something left in the tank. And that is, I don't factor all the other stuff in. So I'll have my writing sprints, but I don't factor in writer's room, which is an hour plus of writing, because also I'm supposed to kind of grade things on a scale of what kind of load it is. And because I'm collaboratively writing with people, it doesn't feel like the heavy lift that is just sitting in front of a blank page writing. But it's still writing. It's still joke writing.
Yeah.
It still takes time, and I don't consider it when I'm necessarily scheduling. So I feel like even though I was a little more realistic with my schedule this week, I'm at Wednesday and I'm delirious and exhausted because I couldn't sleep. I was stressed about things. And even though it's the worst when you have a kid and they're sleeping and you know you should be sleeping and you're not. And so then I was just up watching TV to try and let my mind relax. But I was up too late and now I'm paying for it. So I shouldn't be here on Wednesday like deliriously tired like I am right now, but I've gotten a lot done.
But that's not, but that's, again, it's like you said, that's not just writing. That's like, you recorded a podcast yesterday. We recorded Dumpster Fire today. Like there's other stuff that you're doing.
Yeah, yesterday was nonstop, but I don't factor that in, and perhaps I need to. Perhaps it's realistic for me to write 3 times a week with a heavier load, and 2 times, because I think part of the problem is me writing every day. Like I need that for me, but I don't know that with my current schedule and the baby, it's realistic for me to write for even an hour and a half. It ends up basically being 2 hours. And then that's not including all the other outside writing. So for 2 hours a day, I'm not sure that is, even if I want that to be the case, I'm not sure it's realistic with all the other things.
How's your focus? Has it improved?
Yeah, that's gotten much better. The thing we're also playing around with this week is like different times. So we're doing 10-minute sprints, 45. I did a 45-minute sprint, which like blew by on Monday. I did just one chunk of a 45, or Monday or Tuesday, I did one chunk of a 45-minute sprint instead of these little 25-minute sprints that I've been doing. And it just flew by. I didn't even notice it. So, and I just can get right into it. I do my little,
starting
cue. And I do my,
that was easy.
at the end. And I do mountain climbers at the end too. I'll just do like 50 mountain climbers and then hit that was easy. So that's my kind of reward, which helps. And that button always makes me smile.
Yeah.
So so this week we're doing like, tomorrow I'm going to do just 2 10-minute sprints because I'm going on After Dark with Dr. Drew, which will be fun, but I don't know how much time that's going to take up.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's great progress to be able to be like, oh, last week you were like, my concentration has been shred and my ability to focus. And when I sit down, I'm like, and the fact that you can sit down now and be like, oh yeah, 45 minutes breezed by, in a week. That's great.
2 weeks.
2 weeks. That's great progress.
The first week was a shit show.
Uh,
And the second week was also a shit show. But I also had that project. So this is weird because I can see, you know, I was like, I'm going to work on my book proposal. But then I will literally put anything in the way of writing that book proposal. And now I create barriers for myself, or other pieces where I'm like, oh, now I spoke at this thing over the weekend at the End Speakeasy for Megan Dom. And then there were a bunch of other writers there, and there's nothing worse than when a bunch of writers come up to you after you give your talk, and then they're like, I should write about that. I mean, it's good, I guess, but you're also like, you just took my thing that
I inspired you with.
that I wrote. Or I like outlined for this talk I gave, and you're like, I'm going to go write about that, which fine, it all belongs to the people, but it also makes me realize I need to get that thing out on my own.
Right.
Other than just verbally, it needs to be on paper.
And I think too, you're learning your patterns, which is probably part of this whole exercise, because you've said, you know, the first sprint is always, you can go longer and be focused for longer. And then the second sprint is like, it needs to be shorter. So that's something to you know, work into your schedule.
It's
in the
also
future.
time of day. Like today, because we shot Dumpster Fire in the morning, I couldn't do my sprints normally when I do them in the morning, and I started them at 1:30, and it was much harder to focus.
This is your worst time of day. You've always said that.
Well, it's not the worst. It's like approaching the worst. This is my worst time of day, 3:00. But so I was like, I'll start at 1:30 and kind of get in under the line. But by that third sprint, I was like delirious because I was exhausted. And it's just that time of day where I'm just...
it's not ideal writing time for you.
No, and I was having a hard time like completing thoughts and finding words. And that's always a sign that at a certain point, it's just the diminishing returns. It's not even worth it. Like I accidentally went over on my second sprint because I was trying to complete a thought and I couldn't just end. I just couldn't just stop and come back to it because it was something that I was writing my way through. And instead I started late on that third sprint, but I ended still at the time that I was supposed to end. So it was just, normally I would like go for my 25 minutes and just go over. But instead I was like, no, I'm still ending when I said I was going to end. And this will just be a 20-minute sprint.
Yeah. Well,
it's a good exercise. I like it.
I think people are interested in your progress. I am, you know, to see you kind of training yourself. This is training.
I can get a shitload done too. I mean, I really can. It's also giving me really good insight into how long something takes. I've never kept track of how many hours, and I have now a freaking grid where I can look at it exactly and say that piece took me X amount of hours or minutes or whatever. And I'm also getting an idea because after every single day I have to write about what I accomplished and everything, including things like word count. So I'm getting an idea of how many words I can write in 25 minutes or 45 minutes or whatever on average. And I have the ability I don't labor over word choice and whatnot. I can crank out like 500 words in a 25-minute session.
Yeah, you're a fast writer.
Which is great. You know, I could be doing like 1,000 words, 750 to 1,000 words an hour, which is good if I can maintain that kind of, you know, that every day is a book pretty quickly, like 60 days. So I will keep going. The other thing that's hard is like, when do you do research? And those are things that I just have to build time around.
Right.
It's like, maybe it's not as heavy of a lift, but I need to go now. And I'm also getting much better at because I'll use those, like, I need to go find that quote that Riley Gaines said for this piece. And then it takes me off on some rabbit hole, or I go to Twitter and now it's like, I know I need that quote and I'll just be like, insert Riley Gaines quote and keep going through the piece, which I never used to do.
Yep.
So I think it actually is a more efficient way of writing too.
Absolutely.
Instead of me being like, I need to go find that
Let
quote.
me go find that
25 minutes later.
on Twitter.
Yeah. It's good. I like it. I mean, it's definitely, I have to like talk to my therapist about what comes up.
Well,
because I'm such a, and it also like, I'm such a teacher, not teacher's pet, but I want to, the tendency to like lie about now that I've gone over and I know I'm supposed to be exact, the tendency to want to lie and be like, well, I finished it, 137. I could say I finished at 135
right,
so that I can have that like, get like my gold star.
Right. But that's good that you're like, you're being precise and you're being like 137. It's probably better than 149, like it.
Yeah.
You're getting there. It's a process.
Yeah. I'm still not setting a timer because I don't like having my phone around. So I should be setting a timer, but I don't like it because it then forces me to have my phone around, and sometimes I have headphones on and I'm listening to music and I don't hear the timer go off anyway.
Yeah. So
that I might need like I don't know.
We need a couple countdown clocks in various rooms.
It's a final countdown.
That was easy.
Tune in next week for another riveting episode that will change your life, help you get out of your own way, and solve all the world's problems. I want to thank
our composer, Jared Elias,
my co-producer and cousin, Maggie, and all of you out there listening. This has been Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Phetasy. I'm Bridget Phetasy, and you're welcome. It's the dumbest line.